Hi there! In this video I wanted to spend a few minutes going over the specific details about one of the biological macromolecules we should be able to understand. So in this video I want to talk about carbohydrates, and again the specific details about carbohydrates we should understand so we can answer questions in our course. So as I talked about in an overview video, carbohydrates are things like breads and grains, pasta, rice, right? It's a nutritional component that we consider a lot of the time. So we're going to talk about carbohydrates in respect to biology. And so we're going to go over some specific details, what they're made out of, how they're put together, what the units are, and what their functions are in biology. To start with, I just wanted to point out some details of the name carbohydrate. Hopefully the word carbohydrate will help you understand what carbohydrates are made out of. So down here it says that carbohydrates contain carbon, that's the carbo part of the name. So they contain carbon and hydrogen and oxygen in the same ratio as water. So in water there are 2 hydrogens to every 1 oxygen. That's the hydrate part of the carbohydrate name. So carbohydrates are made out of carbon and water. Now it's not just carbon and water mixed together, they're connected together in different ways. But for every carbon atom, there are 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen in the molecule. So that's why we call them carbohydrates. Anything with the chemical formula that has carbons, and then for every carbon, an equivalent of water, we call that a carbohydrate. So let's think more about these carbohydrates. So we're going to talk about their functions. In biology, carbohydrates have 2 main functions. Carbohydrates serve as a way of storing energy in living things. Okay, later on in the course, we talk a lot about how we can convert sugars into energy that cells can use so that you can move your muscles and use your brain. So carbohydrates are one of the main energy storage molecules in your body and in any living organism. The other thing that carbohydrates do is they add structural support to living things. So we'll look at some specific examples of kinds of carbohydrates and we'll assign their function. Some will serve as energy storage, others will serve as structural support for organisms. So we'll add those names in a little bit. So carbohydrates have those 2 main functions. Carbohydrates are a polymer. They're made out of individual monomer subunits like we've talked about in the past. So we want to think about what monomers carbohydrates are made out of. So carbohydrates are made out of monomers that are sugars. Sometimes we'll call those monomers simple sugars. Other times we might refer to them as monosaccharides. Mono just means 1. Saccharide means sugar. So monosaccharides are single sugars, simple sugars, or we might just say sugar monomers. Those are all ways of describing the same building blocks. So one of the most common sugar monomers that we'll talk about in biology is glucose. So glucose is a super common sugar used to build carbohydrates. So here are some examples of what glucose monomers look like. So here's a picture. Glucose is a ring molecule. So there's this ring in the middle. There are these oxygens and hydrogens attached to it. Everywhere there's a bend in these lines that indicates where a carbon is. So that's one way of representing a glucose molecule. Here's another picture where we've got balls, where the gray balls are the carbon atoms, the red balls are the oxygen atoms, and the white balls are the hydrogen atoms. So those are equivalent molecules. They're just drawn slightly different ways. Here's another diagram where we've straightened out the ring a little bit. Again, anywhere the lines meet, there's a carbon, and then we can see oxygens and hydrogens. Here's one more example of a way people draw sugar molecules. The takeaway point is that these sugars are in a ring form. And again, for every carbon, there's an equivalent number of oxygens and 2 hydrogens. So carbohydrates. Okay, so if we build carbohydrates out of these monomers, again, carbohydrates are sugar polymers. So sometimes we'll also call carbohydrates polysaccharides. Poly just means many. Saccharides again means sugar. So many sugars are carbohydrates, polymers of sugars. We're going to look at several kinds of carbohydrates. So there's a whole bunch of kinds of polysaccharides. They use different sugar monomers depending on which carbohydrate or polysaccharide they are. The way the sugar molecules are attached to one another can differ a little bit. Those details would be far too much for our course, but I just want to show you a few examples. So here's an example of a carbohydrate or polysaccharide, cellulose. It's a bunch of sugar molecules connected together in this chain in this way. And we'll talk more specifically about what cellulose does in just a minute. Here's another example. This carbohydrate or polysaccharide is called starch. It again has a bunch of sugars in a chain, but this chain includes a branch. So a starch is more of a branched chain. It has a slightly different structure, and that's going to change how it works in organisms. Here's another example. Here's glycogen. Glycogen is another polysaccharide or carbohydrate. So it's a bunch of sugars attached together in certain ways. This one's also branched, sort of like starch. It's actually more highly branched than starch. But again, those are details that are probably too in-depth for our class. I just want to show you that there are several kinds of polysaccharides, and they differ in their structure a little bit. The last one I'll show you is something called chitin. Chitin is another polysaccharide that has these two sugars connected together in this way, and that repeats over and over and over again. So in long chains, chitin is another polysaccharide. Okay, so let's think about what these polysaccharides or carbohydrates do, these specific examples. What do they do in organisms? So again, carbohydrates serve two functions. They either store energy or they provide structural support. So for the four examples I just gave you, and these are really common examples in biology, so it's good to remember these four. We can think about cellulose. Cellulose's job is to provide structural support in plants. So animals can't make cellulose, only plants can make cellulose, and it provides structural support. So if you think of like the wood of a tree, the wood of a tree is mostly cellulose. All right. So another polysaccharide or carbohydrate is starch. The job of starch is for energy storage, specifically again in plants. So again, animals can't make starch, only plants can make starch. And the reason plants make starch is to store energy. So that's why you can think of like starchy vegetables like potatoes. Potatoes are full of starch because the plant made all this extra energy and stored it in the potato. It was going to use it later, but we'll often dig up the potato and eat the starch ourselves because it's a good source of energy. All right, so we've got cellulose and starch. Those are plant-specific. Structure, cellulose, energy storage, starch. Another example I gave you was glycogen. Glycogen is another energy storage molecule, but this is the energy storage molecule that animals use. So glycogen animals can make, and glycogen is a good way to store energy. So in your body, for example, your muscles and your brain store a whole bunch of energy in glycogen right there in the muscle and in the brain tissue, so that if they need extra energy to move the muscles, to power the brain, they can use that glycogen right away. So glycogen is all about energy storage in animals. And the last example I gave you was chitin. Chitin is another structural carbohydrate, and it's a structural carbohydrate used in some animals and fungus. So that chitin, excuse me, chitin is most commonly found in the exoskeleton of insects and crustaceans and animals like that. So anything with that hard outer body covering, that covering is made of chitin. And then fungus, they use chitin in their cell wall. But for our purposes, we'll just say, well, chitin is structural support, again, in some animals, and then fungus. All right, so those are the major points of carbohydrates, what the functions are, what the monomers are, right? Sugars connected together into long chains, and then some examples and their function. But I want to point out two other ways we'll talk about carbohydrates. So from time to time, we'll refer to monosaccharides, simple sugars, one sugar, sugar monomers, we'll also consider them carbohydrates. Because we use those, they show up in our diet, and we'll use them in some laboratory experiments and things like that. So some examples of sugar monomers that are still a carbohydrate because they have carbons and then an equal number of water molecules are glucose, that's one example. Fructose is another sugar monomer. Galactose is another sugar monomer. So sometimes we'll talk about those sugar monomers as well. And those things are still carbohydrates, but they're monosaccharides, not polysaccharides. Okay, so we'll see those from time to time. And then the other last detail I wanted to point out about a kind of carbohydrate is that we'll also talk about some sugars that we call disaccharides. Disaccharides just means two sugars. Di means two, saccharide means sugar. So disaccharides are sugar dimers, two sugars connected together. And again, because they have equal parts carbon to water, we call them a carbohydrate, right? So they fall into that group of carbohydrates. And we'll see some examples. Again, if you read nutrition labels, you'll see these. And then maybe in some lab experiments, we'll think about these. So it's things like sucrose. Sucrose is a glucose and a fructose sugar connected together. So two sugars together makes it a disaccharide. Another example is lactose, sugar that we find in milk. Lactose is two individual sugars connected together. They're glucose and galactose. And then one other example might be maltose. Maltose is, again, two sugar molecules attached together. In this case, it's two glucose molecules. So I just wanted to point out, not all carbohydrates are these big polysaccharides where there's thousands of sugars connected together. Every once in a while, we'll refer to carbohydrates that are the simple sugars, the monosaccharides or the disaccharides as well. But in terms of biological function, the energy storage and the structure, those roles are filled by the polysaccharides. Anyway, we'll leave it there. I hope that gives you a good overview of what's going on with carbohydrates. As always, if you have any questions, let me know in the discussion boards or send me a question by email, and I'll talk to you again soon.